Hi, everybody. Dr. Nayo, your wellness doctor, here again with Rupa Health University, offering another talk to give you some more information on how to support wellness. So, what I thought we would speak about today is how different food reactions may influence mood, and in particular, depression, so that everybody can understand what action steps one might take or how one might work with a functional medicine provider to start to look at if this is an issue for you, or even on your own to start to make certain changes that can support wellness, in particular mental health for you. So what I thought we would first start speaking about is the prevalence of food allergies. And this in most likely, in my guess, an underestimation of how the prevalence of food allergies, specifically nut food sensitivities. It's estimated that around a third of the US population has some reaction to food. And the reason it's difficult to quantify the prevalence of how often this is happening is because there aren't agreed upon uniform criteria for diagnosing food allergies, sensitivities, and intolerances. So because the criteria is a little bit murky, it's a little bit tougher to nail down how many people are actually having reactions to food. So what is a food allergy? So there are a couple of different things that we can speak about when we're talking about food reactions, and this is the first one. So a food allergy is specifically, physician would call an IgE-mediated response, immune response. And so IgE is a specific immunoglobulin, which is an aspect of your immune system that can respond as needed if there is an inflammatory signal to do so. So about 10% of the US population is estimated to actually have IgE food allergies. This is what we call a type 1 hypersensitivity. What this means is that when somebody is exposed to what we call an antigen or a protein in a different food, I have an immediate response, an immediate immune response, which is driven by the IgE, part of the immunoglobulins in our immune system. There's also something that we're not going to speak as much of called a late phase immune response, which also involves an IgG reaction. Mostly when you hear people talking about a food allergy, if they're truly meaning a food allergy and not a sensitivity, is this one, the type 1 immediate hypersensitivity to an exposure to any given food. This is reproducible, so that means if you have a true allergy to wheat, if I give you wheat, you will have a reaction each time that I'm giving you the allergen, which is the protein or the antigen that's in that food. So it's reproducible. It's something you can see over and over again. Typically, for an IgE, which again we're going to call a food allergy, the half-life of that response in your body is about 1 to 2 days. So this means that it's going to take at least 1 to 2 days for you to start to begin to really clear this response. And that's assuming you're not re-exposing yourself to this unbeknownst to you. It's going to take about 1 to 2 days to start to clear that type of immune response. One of the classic food reactions that a lot of people are aware of is called celiac disease. This is about 0.5 to 1% of the population across the world. This is what we call a non-IgE mediated response, specifically to a protein in gluten grains called gluten. So this is different than this IgE response, which is specifically a certain aspect of our immune systems, their immunoglobulins that react when needed in response to something that's perceived to be a threat. Celiac is not an IgE-mediated response, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a second. There are also what are called mixed IgE and non-IgE-mediated food allergies. The classic example of this is eosinophilic esophagitis. We're not going to get super into this because this is a more complex diagnosis, but just to kind of be forthright with the different types of food allergies, that's what we have. Another type of reaction that many of you have probably already heard of that falls under a different immune response is called a food sensitivity. This is an immune-mediated response that's called a delayed hypersensitivity. So this means that if I am repeatedly exposed to something and there's a weakness in the immune system that makes me vulnerable to have a different food reaction or immune response, I have a different aspect of my immune system or immunoglobulin system called the IgG immunoglobulin, and this is a delayed response. So this is not you eat wheat for the first time and you have a reaction. There's some weakness in the immune system, the gut, the microbiome, and I'm repeatedly exposed to something and my body starts to see this as a threat. So this is something that's going to develop over time. So it's called a delayed hypersensitivity. The half-life of this reaction is anywhere from 22 to 96 days. So this means that if you're having a reaction to something like gluten, let's keep using that, that means that it's going to take you at least 3 weeks to a month to really start to clear that antigen and therefore dampen the reaction that you're having. And that means no repeated exposure for that amount of time. But it can take up to 96 days to really start to see a clear abatement of the symptoms that are related to whatever your immune system is responding to. All right, what is a food intolerance? So this is the third category that I'm going to talk about under immune reactions. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I just want to make folks aware of this because this is something a functional medicine provider may be looking into if you're having issues or reactions to different foods. So this is different. This is a non-immunologic response, which means before I mentioned that an allergy, which is an immediate reaction, is IgE. That's a part of your immune system. And a food sensitivity is an IgG. That's the delayed, the longer one that takes to develop over time. This is different. This is a non-immunologic response, so it's not involving your immune system. A classic one is lactose intolerance, and this is because particularly people, as we get older, we lack the lactase enzyme that allows us to be able to break this sugar lactose down. So because our body can't break it down, there's an intolerance. So you'll hear the classic bloating or other digestive symptoms, diarrhea, constipation, and it's an inability to break this sugar down because there's no longer enough of this enzyme lactase to break that down. So that's your first classic food intolerance, which is not mediated by your immune system that one might be aware of. One that is getting a little bit more buzz lately is histamine intolerance. This is when it's usually in conjunction with something else that's going on in the system. But basically, it's when we're not able to break down histamine that's we're getting from our diet, and that is in our GI tract. And it's because we don't have a sufficient amount of this enzyme, the diamine oxidase or DAO enzyme, to break the histamine down. And as I said, this is usually associated with some other imbalance or issue going on in our systems. Other non-immunologic reactions could be something in which people are eating FODMAP foods. So a lot of people know about this because of something called SIBO, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And that part of that, generally managing that and starting to get to the bottom of it, is removing high FODMAP foods. So this is a category of different foods that for certain folks are very difficult to digest. So again, it's not an immune system problem alone. This is something going on in the small intestine is one of the classic reasons people don't tolerate FODMAPs. Then we have a couple of other ones I mentioned here. We're not going to go into much detail, but tyramine, lectins, nightshades, oxalates, and salicylates. So these are also things that people can start to have issues with as well. Oftentimes, some of those, at least in part, are associated with something else going on. So the gut, the microbiome, etc., not being as healthy. Then we have food additives. So MSG is one that people have probably heard of. When manufacturers, food producers are adding gums to their foods, that can be a problem for people. Nitrates, and then any other preservative. And I mentioned carrageenan because this is one people are pretty aware of that can be added to things like nut milks and things like that. And that can be a problem for the gut too, and support leaky gut and some other things. So these are all not mediated by your immune response and can be causing issues. and this is what we would classify as a food intolerance. So, what are causes or contributors to food reactions and depression? Because you're going to see that a lot of times with much of what we talk about in functional medicine, you're going to have a lot of crosstalk between what's actually causing the problem, because they're usually not separate problems that have nothing to do with the other. So genetics or epigenetics is a big one that can contribute to either someone having a food reaction or having depression, or both. A C-section birth, and this is important because when we're born, passing through the birth canal, many of you already know this, you pick up a lot of your mother's microbiome, which informs and helps you to develop your own immune system. So when this is bypassed with a C-section birth, that can pose a challenge for people and be a setup for food reactions, and later down the line may play a role in mood. Not being breastfed is a big one. It's another thing that's really important. You're getting a lot of nutrients and immunoglobulins through the breast milk. Everybody probably is aware of colostrum and how important that is, but also a lot of nutrients, vitamins. There are particular fats and prebiotics and things that are in the breast milk that is very important, that informs our microbiome and therefore our gut and therefore our immune system. And that sounds like that would have nothing to do with depression. However, many of you have probably heard of the gut-brain connection, and they're intimately linked. So generally, when one starts to go awry, and it's usually the gut first, the brain is also, because it has so people have probably heard of the gut barrier, and people can have a leaky gut barrier. The same thing can happen with the brain. So when you start to see that, if a leaky gut, and people also have depression, anxiety, or other mental health diagnoses, we need to be starting to think, is there a breach in that blood-brain barrier? And so that's the first way that things could go amiss in the brain and with mental health. But also a lot of the neurotransmitters that the brain needs for mental health are actually, in part at least, made in the gut. So when one goes, the gut in particular, starts to have issues, it can start to be a setup for the brain and mental health as well. Then we have delayed exposure to allergens, especially in infancy. So there's some work that's being looked at that potentially exposing children at a younger age to foods that may actually be more helpful in informing the immune system. Now, you certainly would want to be working with a functional medicine pediatrician to know when and what is appropriate, but there is some evidence that's showing that sometimes when we're withholding things like peanuts and things like that, that actually may be more of a setup that the person can't deal with it later. Next, we have stress. Stress is, you're always going to hear me talking about stress. I say all the time, if there's one thing that I could have everybody do, it would be to decrease stress. I just think it's so important to everybody's well-being. The mechanism that I would say for that is, one, when you're stressed, everything starts to not work in balance. So your gut is not going to be working in tandem with your immune system, and your brain and the integrity of the blood-brain barrier is not going to be as healthy. The more you bring the stress response down, hormones are going to support your system. The gut is going to maximize digestion, absorption. Everything starts to work in harmony when you take your body out of a fight or flight stress situation. So this is just so important. Okay, so how do food reactions affect food? So this first couple slides, I'm going to talk to you a lot about gluten, because that's where a lot of the data is specifically around the effect of that particular protein, gluten, on mood. So gluten and other inflammatory foods in general, or even additives, can also trigger an inflammatory response, which can lead to either an allergy or sensitivity. So that's that cycle that I was talking to you about with the setup with genetics or just toxic load from exposure, then having some response, some allergic response, then developing a leaky gut, then that just gets propagated more and more. So that can happen with a lot of different inflammatory foods. Probably the syndrome or the disease that we know the most about around food reactions may be celiac disease. It's just very well researched. And what we know is that typically what happens that after insults, so I mentioned having a genetic predisposition, the gut lining becomes leaky. So there's increased intestinal permeability. With this, there's a heightened immune response to proteins, and in particular here we're talking about gluten, but it could be a different protein with another food. Gluten can then build up in the small intestine, and then a person becomes, if they're genetically predisposed from their epigenetics, they then can mount an immune response to gluten and other proteins in the gluten grains. And I should say gluten grains include things like wheat, barley, rye, spelt, teff, farro. So those are some of the classic gluten grains. What can then happen if the person has that genetic propensity for celiac disease is that the body starts to attack the small intestine. So it's an autoimmune disease. Okay, so now what we have here is the pathogenesis of allergies. So this I've kind of pulled together from really good talks I've either heard or other resources. It's a little tougher to see. But this first one is looking at or stating that if you have a genetic predisposition, so some sort of mutation or just genetic propensity that you've inherited that makes you more vulnerable for allergies or a weakness in the gut, microbiome, or food reactions like celiac, then that's one thing that can start this process. And I should have stated pathogenesis just means the unhealthy development of disease is what pathogenesis means. So we're going to go through what the process is that may be leading to people having not just allergies, but food reactions in general. So you could have a genetic predisposition that could be leading to that. There could be also environmental factors that are also supporting this as well. As you know, we live in a very toxic world oftentimes with different things that we're exposed to. So these are two factors that could be at play. So that, if that is going on, this then could lead to an increased risk for allergic responses. That then could propagate and support increased intestinal permeability. So that's how functional medicine doctors speak of leaky gut. We call it increased intestinal permeability. So by having weaknesses, whether they're genetic or environmental exposures or toxins, that then supports the first increased allergic response, but then that gets exacerbated because then by having the allergen exposure, which is usually the first exposure is usually happening in the gut because that's our internal environment. The first place that usually is seeing those allergens is in the gut, or one of the first places. That then is the setup for the gut becoming leaky because it's exposed to all these allergens. The immune system gets overwhelmed and we start to see a larger load of allergens. That then supports a leaky gut. So the breakdown of that gut barrier that's protecting us from foreign things coming in that are not supposed to, toxins, proteins that are too big and they're not well digested, all of that tends to happen more with this first allergic response, starts to create a leaky gut. And this allows that antigen that's in any given food. So we're going to talk about wheat. It's going to allow gluten to get through in larger amounts and larger antigens, larger proteins that it's not supposed to. So then your immune system has to respond. So then we develop something called improper oral intolerance, which means we're basically having an overwhelmed hyperimmune response. So it's like a fire in the gut because you're getting too many antigens or proteins coming in that are not really supposed to. Your immune system tries to respond, it's overwhelmed, so then it starts to have an improper immune response, which is called an oral intolerance response. Then that's the setup for us to have more of an allergic sensitivity. So because this is kind of keeps going on, it progresses. And so we start to become more and more sensitive. This ultimately could lead to systemic reaction. This also could then lead to even more leaky gut or increased intestinal permeability, and that just propagates this whole thing. So more allergen gets through, leakier gut, more of an immune response, and then leaky gut again. And then this ultimately leads to an increased intestinal exposure to the antigen, and that's ultimately when we start to see more and more of an immune response, and therefore people become more symptomatic and start to have signs of food reactions. So that's in summary what we're seeing. So let's start to talk about depression, since we set the background for what's going on with the different food reactions. So depression is a big category. So some of the mood disorders, and this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the mood disorders that include depression or depressive symptoms are unipolar depression. So that's the classic major depression disorder that you've probably grown up knowing about. There's melancholic depression. This is the hallmarks of this type of depression is people tend to have a loss of pleasure, more sadness. This means SX means morning symptoms. They tend to have insomnia where they're wakening in the middle of the night. They may have weight loss because they lose their appetite. So these are kind of the hallmarks of melancholic depression. We also have atypical depression, which tends to be associated with weight gain, increased appetite, hypersomnia, which means you sleep too much. And these are kind of like opposite ends of the pole of depression. We also have seasonal affective disorder, which many of you are aware of. When it becomes late fall and winter, there's less sun exposure. Also, vitamin D levels are on the lower side. This can be something that people experience. We have bipolar depression. We also have persistent depression disorder. This used to be known as dysthymia. It's like kind of a low-level background, low mood. So the intensity is not as severe, but it's long-lasting. So it has a longer duration. And then PMS and PMDD. These are typically symptoms of low mood that are happening during the luteal phase of a woman's menstrual cycle. Okay, so how do food reactions affect mood? So we're going to talk a lot about gluten initially because there's a little bit more research around that and how gluten, the protein in wheat grains, wheat, barley, rye, spelt, teff, farro, how that protein gluten impacts mood. So we're going to talk about celiac disease first because that's where there's a lot of research that elucidates this a little bit more for us. So what can happen? Remember I said with that cycle, we can have a genetic predisposition to be vulnerable for celiac disease. So there's certain antibodies we can check to know if that's the case. So if that person was predisposed by genetics, they can begin to have increased intestinal permeability as the result of not just the genetic predisposition, but different exposures that are happening throughout their life, their microbiome not being as healthy, different things, that initial list that I told you of all the things that can go into the health of the gut and the immune system in the brain. All of those things could be a setup for people being vulnerable to having a food reaction, but here specifically celiac. But celiac is specifically if you have the genes that align with that, and then you have some sort of exposure to gluten and a leaky gut. So then the next thing that happens is the gut becomes leaky. And remember what I said, once that gut becomes leaky, more and more antigen or protein gets through the gut. So in this case, gluten, then your immune system has to respond to it. And then that creates a fire in the gut. That fire over time starts to overwhelm your immune system. So that heightened immune response then starts to lead, because it's an autoimmune disease, celiac, gluten builds up in the small intestine because too much is getting through. And then the predisposed person to celiac disease starts to mount a response to gluten and other proteins. So again, a more and more heightened immune response. This can ultimately, because it's an autoimmune disease, autoimmune means that the body does not recognize itself. So if the person was genetically set up for it, the body can start attacking the small intestine, and specifically the immune system can start to attack the small intestine because it doesn't realize that the small intestine is itself. And then this causes atrophy of the villi. So these are like finger-like projections in the small intestine that help support absorption of key minerals, nutrients, etc. And then the immune system is attacking that and instead of digesting the gluten. So your body's dealing with a heightened immune response, the fire in the gut, trying to put that out instead of digesting the gluten. This then further leads to even more increased intestinal permeability, as well as inflammation with the undigested gluten that gets through. This just keeps propagating itself more and more if the gluten is not removed from a person's diet and they have this genetic predisposition as well as the microbiome, the gut itself, is not healthy. So this chronic inflammation ultimately can lead to an inflamed brain and mental health imbalance. So remember I said that because oftentimes when you start to breach that gut barrier and that becomes leaky, inflamed, a heightened immune response, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times you can start to have a leaky blood-brain barrier as well. So that's the first problem. The second problem, remember I said, is that neurotransmitters, which help to regulate mood and mental health, a lot of them are made in the gut. So when the gut is not healthy, that's not happening properly. So to get a little bit, just to give you a little bit more information, I mentioned on the last slide that there's specific antibodies that one can look at, specifically a functional medicine provider can look at to assess whether somebody actually has the setup for celiac disease. So in celiac disease, there's something called autoantibodies that produce something called tissue transglutaminase 6. This is expressed in the brain. There's also anti-gliadin antibodies, and they play a large role in neurologic and psychiatric disease in celiac patients. And then there are also T lymphocytes in the brain tissue that can also support neurologic disease and imbalance, particularly something called neuropathy. So that's when the nerves in our body are firing improperly. So what we have found to date is that there's a high percentage of patients that have celiac disease that have depression when they're compared to the general population. And it's because all of these different aspects of the immune system, they're hyperregulated. So again, there's like a fire in the system. You're throwing all these antibodies and immune system cells to try to deal with the fire. This actually starts to impact the fire in the brain, or the nervous system starts to impact the health, one, of mental health, but the neurologic system in general. So other food reactions, how is that affecting mood? So there isn't as much data, we'll look at a little bit, but there isn't as much data on specific foods and how the mechanism that they're creating mood imbalance. In general, though, what there is data on is that when we're eating a more unhealthy processed diet, which could include food sensitivities, along with other stressors, that can support increased inflammation, one in the gut, but then also in the brain. And as a result, your immune system's going to put out these different immune cells that are going to respond to that fire. So with more fire or inflammation, that is one thing that we definitely see with an unhealthy processed inflammatory diet. This then can lead to increased intestinal permeability and blood-brain barrier permeability. Remember, I said a lot of times they can go hand in hand. So if you have someone with digestive symptoms and they start to be really anxious or have mood imbalance, kind of think about this connection that there could be either the leaky blood-brain barrier as well as the leaky gut barrier, or it could also be that the person's not able to properly make the different neurotransmitters and balance them because of the problem in the gut. So it's very important to realize this connection, the gut-brain connection, when we're thinking about mood or mental health. All of this can cause chronic systemic inflammation, which we know about. So that's the person who has gut issues that just start initially as bloating, constipation, abdominal pain, which could be like your classic IBS, which is basically your trash can term that some doctors use. It's not actually a true diagnosis to let us know what's going on. But with that IBS, then you can start to see people have more chronic systemic inflammation. So they could start to have more joint pain, muscle pain. They could start to also have menstrual issues. So that's something you could see with imbalance in the gut health. But neuroinflammation is one that is starting to be recognized more and more, because the fire does not stay in the gut all the time if you don't put it out with a functional medicine or other healing approach to put the fire out. And ultimately, one of the places that can be vulnerable is the brain and nervous system. So this is just to really just drive home that in non-celiac disease, the mechanisms that food reactions can be playing in creating depression, it's not as easy to sort out for a specific food. It's more looking at foods that are creating inflammation, whether that could be a healthy food. So if somebody's having response to nuts, let's say, that's not necessarily a processed unhealthy food, but if it's creating inflammation because the person cannot digest it and handle it, and instead they're developing an inflammatory response. So fire in the gut, maybe fire in the brain, that's a mechanism to be aware of. And there's not as much data on specific foods outside of gluten. It's more looking at, is a food creating inflammation? Anything that's creating inflammation creates vulnerability in the gut and the brain potentially. So there isn't as much data on specific foods impacting mood as seen with gluten, both in celiac and non-celiac. There is some on gluten's impact on non-celiac disease patients, which we'll look at, but other foods, as I mentioned, we don't have as much for specific foods mediating a different immune response. So that's why I started to break it out and think about it after we start talking about gluten, is thinking about it in terms of more inflammatory foods. So these don't have to just be classically unhealthy foods. This could be any food sensitivity that we're eating and it's propagating an immune or inflammatory response. So a fire in the belly and potentially a fire in the brain. So this is a study that was a meta-analysis that looked at 17 studies. You can see they looked at almost 160,000 patients. And what they found was that individuals that had more pro-inflammatory diets, they were 45% more likely to suffer from depression and 66% more likely to have anxiety disorders than those that were on anti-inflammatory diets. So this could be your standard American processed diet, or it could just be the gut's not healthy, microbiome's not healthy, and you're eating a healthy diet that could still be creating a problem because it's generating inflammation in the gut and the brain. So I don't want to just, have people thinking that inflammation is only coming from your standard American diet. If you have food reactions, that's something you definitely want to be sorting through with your functional medicine provider for sure. So what studies elucidated is that inflammatory nutrients may activate our innate immune system. So there are different branches of the immune system. The innate immune system is one. This, once stimulated by inflammatory nutrients, can lead to chronic low-grade inflammation. As a result, a poor diet is going to support the microbiome in being more unhealthy. So let's say your standard American diet that's very processed with sugar, processed flour, lacking nutrients, that is not going to feed the good bugs in your microbiome. It's going to feed the bad ones, which are going to promote inflammation, leaky gut, leaky brain, etc. The more that the increased intestinal permeability happens and more inflammation or fire in the belly and brain happens, that's been more associated with depression with these more inflammatory, nutrient deficient diets. So we see the loss of a healthy microbiome, which is essential for gut health, immune system health, brain and mental health. And then we also see a leaky gut as well as chronic inflammation, which we refer to as neuroinflammation. Then on top of that, if you have stress and insulin resistance, that is going to further exacerbate this inflammatory response and leaky gut. So fire in the brain, fire in the belly, and then just promoting and propagating this whole thing to keep going. Then that also supports feeding the unhealthy bugs in your microbiome, which then is going to make your immune system unhealthy. So that's how I want us to start to think about how are both unhealthy inflammatory foods as well as undiagnosed food sensitivities, how could they be promoting and supporting an imbalance in our mood? It's not just our standard processed American foods, but an undiagnosed food reaction could be propagating an inflammatory response as well as supporting leaky gut. And then on top of that, promoting insulin resistance, which just inflames that whole system even more, which is a bigger fire in the belly and brain. So just to show you a little bit more data on this, when we look at inflammatory foods and mood, this is one study that looked at that there's strong evidence to suggest that the gut microbiota plays an important role bidirectionally in the gut and nervous system. So this is this gut-brain axis where we talk about that connection. So when the gut is inflamed with the bugs that are in your microbiome and the immune system is just upregulated trying to deal with the fire, that impacts the brain, and it goes both ways. So the more that one becomes inflamed, if you don't address it, it just exacerbates the whole situation. So it interacts with central nervous system by regulating brain chemistry. So that's your neurotransmitters that are helping to balance mood, so serotonin, dopamine, etc., and also influencing the neuroendocrine systems that are associated with your stress response, anxiety, and memory function. So you can see that just taking out inflammatory foods, whether it's, your more processed standard American diet, or thinking about working with a functional medicine provider if you're having digestive symptoms or any mental health diagnoses, to look at, could you be eating something that you're not aware of that could be inflaming your gut and brain, that could really just help to calm the whole system down and support healing. It's just something really to think about if you're having any issues in the gut or the brain. When eating an inflammatory diet, that leads, as I said before, to an unhealthy microbiome, which plays a big role in supporting mood disorders. So I put this little graphic together just to drive home some of the contributors to mood disorders with food reaction. So if you have poor gut health and microbiome health, because your gut's not seeing healthy nutrients that are feeding the microbiome, there's not enough fiber in your gut to support the bugs to grow, or you have a leaky gut, as I mentioned, or there's a fire in the gut. All of that is a setup to support mental health imbalance, gut imbalance, and immune health imbalance. So this becomes a fire in the gut and the brain via the immune system. So that's your first setup to support mood imbalance with different food reactions. If your diet is nutrient deficient, so meaning it's not rich in whole foods, meaning plant-based with healthy proteins that can be animal-based as long as they're whole foods and not processed, your omega-3 fats, which are very important for your immune system, your brain, your gut, just so many different things. If you're not having those protein, fiber, which feeds the bugs in your gut, and lots of phytonutrients, that is problematic because it's a setup for your microbiome not to get the nutrients, fiber, and things that it needs to feed the good bugs. And so what happens when you don't feed the garden with healthy fertilizer and you're feeding it a bunch of junk, weeds are going to grow. So that's how I want you to think about every time you're eating a lot of processed food. It's not fertilizer to support growth. It's basically just junk that's going to support the growth of weeds, which is going to happen in a very haphazard, irregular way that's not supporting the whole lawn to grow. You're going to have patches here and patches here. So think about that when you're eating. Are you fertilizing your microbiome and your gut with healthy nutrients, which is going to include a lot of these things that I mentioned? The other piece to drive home is that it should be a low glycemic diet. And that doesn't mean you can't have, any fruit or anything like that. It just means you shouldn't be having tons of processed food, which feed the bad bugs, which is problematic. The other problem with eating a high glycemic diet, sugar, etc., is it's like pouring gasoline on the fire. So it's just more fuel for the fire when you're eating a lot of sugar or processed carbs. Next thing that could play a role in generating food reactions is stress. So the more that you are in stress, you're over here where you're out of the mode where your body tends to want to detox, where it wants to balance blood sugar and insulin, where it wants to more efficiently use fuel when you're stressed. And so when you're stressed, your body's dealing with inflammation and your metabolic system becomes very imbalanced. So that's why you see when people are stressed, they have more insulin resistance, they have more cardiovascular disease, etc. So anytime you're living in a stress state, you're over here where restoration is not even available to you. So you want to pull yourself out of the stress mode where detoxification is available, you're getting good sleep, you're meditating, etc., because that's where that happens. Your metabolic system, including regulating blood sugar and insulin, that happens better over here when you're out of a state of stress. And then that takes me to this next point, insulin resistance. So the more you're eating a high processed diet, rich in sugar, processed carbs, etc., it's inflaming your gut and brain. So that's what we're looking at here. All right, so this is, again, going back to looking at gluten and impact on mood, and this is a study looking at gluten and mood, impact on mood and celiac disease. So one study found that major depression disorder, dysthymic order, which is that low level, kind of long-lasting low mood, and adjustment disorders were more common in celiac disease patients compared to controls. Controls are people who don't have the disease. Another study showed that dysthymia, that low level, low mood in celiac disease compared to controls, was also supported. So there was more of that seen in patients who had celiac. Another study found that celiac patients were more likely to be diagnosed with depression when compared to people without celiac disease. And then another study found that celiac disease patients had improvement in depressive symptoms when they were on a gluten-free diet. So the bottom line is that these studies elucidated that there's a higher prevalence of mood disorders in celiac disease compared to non-celiac disease. So when we look at the impact that it's having, this is another study that looked at celiac disease in adolescents. And what we found, or what they found, was that the majority of adolescents with depression and behavioral symptoms, they had those symptoms before they were diagnosed with celiac. So it was just undiagnosed. They found that they had low levels of free tryptophan. That's a necessary amino acid to make serotonin, which is one of the brain chemicals or neurotransmitters that helps with mood. So in this study, they put these adolescents on a gluten-free diet, and they saw the depressive symptoms and behavioral problems improve. What they also found in conjunction with that is that their L-tryptophan levels increased. So remember I said that's an amino acid that supports increasing your serotonin levels. They found that the antibodies of these adolescent patients for celiac, they actually went down. So they're seeing that the immune response calmed down on a gluten-free diet because the immune system wasn't having to react because there's no gluten in the system, or at least less. There was also seen to be a disturbance in the serotonergic activity with low tryptophan levels in these patients who had depression. So remember I said that serotonin is a key neurotransmitter that helps with regulating mood, and that when you have these low tryptophan amino acid levels, that's supportive of depression. So by changing their diet, the L-tryptophan was able to come up, and then likely the serotonin was able to come up as well. So they concluded that there was impaired availability of this amino acid tryptophan in untreated celiac adolescents, and that was what was making them more vulnerable for depression and behavioral issues. So more on celiac, this was a meta-analysis that found that celiac patients, when they were compared to healthy patients, they had a significant increased risk for having a psychological or neurodevelopmental disorder, and depression was one of those. Now, here's a little bit on non-celiac disease, gluten sensitivity, and impact on mood. This was a study that looked at an elderly population with known gluten sensitivity, and they compared them to non-gluten sensitive elderly folks. And what they found is the gluten sensitive elderly patients were twice as likely to have depression when they were compared to the elderly patients without gluten sensitivity. So again, what this is really driving home is that when there's an inflammatory protein that's coming through the gut, impacting the gut, the immune system, and the brain, that's inflaming the brain as well, which is supporting mood imbalance. So this is looking again at non-celiac disease. This study, just to be a little bit succinct about it, it was a crossover study where there were 3 different diets that the people were exposed to. Initially, they all had a low FODMAP, gluten-free diet, and then after 3 weeks of that diet, they were randomized to one of 3 of these diets. They had a gluten challenge diet, and then that was for 3 days. And that was after they had the gluten-free low FODMAP diet. Then another group had the whey challenge, which means whey was a big component of their diet. And then there was the placebo diet. And so all of the groups did the diets for 3 days. And then after 3 to 14 days, they had a washout diet before they went to the next diet. So if a group was on this diet, then they would wash out for a period and then do this diet, so that we could see the same patient, how did they respond to a different diet. And what they found was they used this score called the SPTI score that helped people to self-assess for symptoms after the dietary challenge. And they found that the SPTI score for depression was statistically significant, which just means from a research standpoint, it's real. It was statistically significantly higher in the gluten group versus the placebo group. So that means the people who had gluten had more depression versus those that did not. So when we're thinking about assessing for food reactions, what are we thinking about? So one of the first things that a functional medicine provider will think about doing is a functional stool analysis. And you can probably understand why by now. And that's because if the gut is leaky, so increased intestinal permeability, the microbiome is not healthy, there are too many bad bugs, not enough good bugs, this is potentially a problem because it means leaky gut and potentially leaky brain. So you're not going to get the neurotransmitters to the brain and you may not be making them well. So that's one of the first things that a functional medicine doctor may be thinking about, because we have to heal the gut in order to heal the brain and the immune system. You got to put the fire out at the source. So that would be one thing that we would be thinking about. Another thing we would be thinking about is food allergy and sensitivity testing. There are different options. I just put a couple, and these are for sensitivity, not allergy. There's an IgG test where you can get 96 to 100 and some odd foods that look at that delayed immune response to tell us if you have a sensitivity to something. There's the ALCAT and the MRT. These are both looking at your white blood cell response when you're exposed to an antigen. So when your blood is exposed to a protein that potentially could be inflammatory, do your white cells respond? Do they go up? And that tells us whether you're having a reaction to the food. So these are three options that your functional medicine doctor may use to assess a food sensitivity. I didn't put it here for IgE. The gold standard, I will say, for all of them, though, has been to do an elimination diet. So remove the food and then reintroduce and see if you have a reaction. You do not want to do that if you have a severe reaction. So that would be anaphylaxis, throat closing, oropharynx, your mouth and that tissues swollen. Anything where it's a serious reaction, typically you would only do that in a controlled medical setting where they have the ability to intubate and to give you, immediate medicine if you have that response. But for a food sensitivity, that would be something that we would consider if you weren't ready to do this. Then there's the adrenal stress index. The reason I like this is I like for my clients to understand how stress is really creating issues in their system. And so when you can see this directly, it's eye-opening. So that oftentimes would be something that I would mention to clients because stress drives all disease. Then there's micronutrient testing. This would probably not be the first thing most functional medicine providers would be thinking about, but this can help us to understand, are you absorbing and getting the key minerals, nutrients, fats, etc., that your body needs, that your gut needs, that your brain needs, that your immune system needs. So that's an option as well. And then I just put here, if there's any severe mental illness, definitely work with a functional medicine provider, but you want to be working with someone if it's severe to get that stabilized. Okay, so this is my kind of quick and dirty. Each one of these steps could be a whole talk in and of themselves, but if you've been in the midst of functional medicine, this probably is not new information to you. Whenever we think about addressing food reactions, gut issues, mental health issues, etc., we're thinking about a root cause approach. Now, mine is a little bit out of order the way you may classically see, but we call this the 5R program that you can do with a functional medicine provider. So usually rebalance is the last step. For me, this is the first. I need for people to work on stress, become aware of how stress is driving disease imbalance in their body. So this is paramount. It's very difficult to heal the system when there's stress amiss. So this is not good. You don't have to be perfect with it, but I want people to start working on this because the more you cool that stress response down, it's a lot easier for the body to just fall in line and heal. So you want to reduce stress in the rebalance part of the 5R program. Mindfulness, once you want that to become a foundational element of your day. Meditation, you want to be doing that because that turns on a lot of things that literally will support driving your immune system into a healing mode instead of an inflammatory kind of panic mode. And then you want to spend time in nature. There's a lot of data that is showing that when you're in green and in nature, that it sends a healing response to your brain. You also want to get optimal sleep, preferably getting in bed by 10, at least 8 hours. But these, if you can just start making a little bit of progress, again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but start to make this a priority, that's very helpful. The second R would be to remove all inflammatory or processed foods. A lot of times this is going to fall under an elimination diet. This does not and should not be indefinite. We want to heal the gut at some point and start to replenish foods to allow you to add things back. But we want a cool out phase so your immune system, your gut, everything can start to cool down because you pull out the inflammatory foods while you work to heal the gut. So this is the foods that you know you're reacting to, and then any possible reactions. So I put some of the classic ones, but if you did an elimination diet with a functional medicine provider, the list would be longer than this. And then the next R is to replace. You're going to replace any missing enzymes or supporting nutrients. So sometimes that means you're going to need digestive enzymes that are going to help you break down the proteins, the carbohydrates, etc. in your diet. HCl, which is important for digestion as well, different vitamins, minerals, and fats. So that may be something that your functional medicine provider would add on. The enzymes and HCl may be really important if you're having a lot of digestive and gut issues, because you may not be breaking your protein and other nutrients down, which could actually be really making it more and more difficult to get the proper nutrients in that you need. So that may be something that your doctor does with you. The next R is you want to re-inoculate. So you want to build up your microbiome with healthy bugs. This helps to drive down the unhealthy bugs while you're doing all these other things to help with that. And it's going to help to build up your immune system. The last R is you want to repair. You want to add healing supplements and foods to repair the gut lining. This is going to be tailored for you, especially if you do a functional stool analysis. This will be tailored based on what your medical provider, your functional medicine provider finds on that. But some of the classic things that you would add are glutamine, aloe, zinc, carnosine, bone broth, and immunoglobulins. So I hope this has been helpful, just to help you to start to understand that certainly a standard American diet is going to potentially inflame your gut, your immune system, and your brain, but also be thinking about it in terms of maybe healthier foods that you're reacting to that could also be driving this inflammatory process in the gut and the brain that could be exacerbating depression, anxiety, and other mood imbalances. So I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening. Have a great day.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.